Aloha and welcome to Figments, the Power of Imagination, season something, episode, whatever. I think it's 4 and 7 respectively, but it's going to be a great show. I know this already because my guest, well, you'll hear about him in a second. I'm here, we're here to entertain and inspire. Got a story titled Imagine the Ghost of Kyiv, because the ghost of Kyiv was a supposedly a Ukrainian fighter pilot flying either the MiG 29 or the Su-27 in heroic fashion. Turned out to be a myth, but we have the first Western pilot ever to qualify in the Su-27 flanker. More on that in a second. I just want to thank all of our viewers because the last episode of Figments, The Power of Imagination, was the most watched ever by a long margin. And in fact, we actually beat the movie Top Gun Maverick 2-1. Unbelievable. We had 2,000 viewers. They only made $1 billion. Okay, we made $0, but it was a lot of fun and it's a good movie. So we're going to build on that. Now, we're going to build on that by talking about flying the Su-27 and putting it into context with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because our guest had a unique opportunity to gain insight to Russia, Russian culture, and the Russian military that we'll hope with we share with that. I got an email from a friend of mine who saw that episode and he said, and this is for you, Bull Rios. He said, you need more pretty faces on your shows. Well, that's not us. We're not pretty faces, but we do other things. Me and my guest, Major General retired Dallas Thompson, recently wrote an article I commend to you. The U.S. must counter collective nuclear blackmail available on Real Clear Defense. More on that later. But we're serious guys. And with that, let me welcome Dallas Thompson, Major General, retired U.S. Air Force. Hey, Dallas, aloha.
Hey, sir. How are you?
Good. Glad to see you. Gone with the aloha shirt. You're looking marvelous.
When in Hawaii, virtually do what the Hawaiians do, I suppose.
Yeah. How's the weather in Texas? Is it hot and humid?
Hot. Just hot.
Yeah, we talked sometime last week when you just come in from a couple hours of yard work. I thought I might lose you, frankly. Well, it's Hawaii, so we're fine. Boy, you've had an exciting life flying in the Air Force, flying with the Navy, and flying with the Russians. Here's a picture of you in action during your exciting life. It looks like you're just on the edge of your seat, but in a different way than normal, right?
That was the party the first night that after they picked us up at the airport when we got to Tchaikovsky. And it was, I described it as an international invitational vodka swallowing contest. My only defense is that it was about 2:00 in the morning. I walked out of the dining room under my own power until I got to that bank of chairs. They carried Sergei out. So I consider that a moral victory.
Victory. In this endeavor that we're going to talk about, you were trying to provide capability to the United States Air Force and United States Navy for similar air combat training. And I'd like to take a minute to explain that to people. In our last episode, we talked about the difference between Top Gun, the Navy weapons school, and the Air Force fighter weapons school. The second, the latter, the Air Force version, being more an inclusion of academics, et cetera, et cetera. Top Gun focused on fighting against different airplanes. Now, why is that important? Because they're different airplanes, not just in terms of capability, but merely visually. If you're not looking at one airplane that's, or two or three or four, that's friendly, looking differently from the bad guys, it's very hard to simulate the combat environment. And another thing was a lesson learned from air combat in Vietnam that the first time you see a MiG, the bad guys, there's a bit of buck fever, a bit of shock to the system in seeing that, and the reaction isn't helpful for survival. So both services pursued dissimilar air combat training. They used a variety of airplanes, like the F-5, like the A-4, some from Israel, Kafirs. I've got a story about Kafirs. But it's always been a challenge, and it's a challenge that continues today. They just stood up the first F-35 aggressor squadron.
Yeah.
More on that someday. But Dallas, you had a chance to provide some real dissimilar air combat training with frontline airplanes that were leased from the Russian government, right? How did this
Yep.
happen? How did this start?
Well, you remember in the peace dividend, one of the first things that went with the budget cuts was the aggressor squadrons.
Yep.
After the wall went down, Russian test pilots began attending Society of Experimental Test Pilot conventions in the United States. This program came together because of the skipper that hired me into VX4 years before was
And the
at
Navy
this
Exchange.
right, the Navy Exchange was at this SETP convention, and he met what was going to be a Russian cosmonaut on their equivalent of our equivalent of the space shuttle, a guy named Sergei Tresvietsky. And they put together this straw man for a aggressor program wherein a company we would dry lease MiG-29s or Su-27s. I eventually, as the chief pilot, would be chartered with getting reserve and guard pilots to fly them in the program. And then we would sell this program, not just to the Air Force and the Navy, but worldwide. And so
So
it all
it's a
began,
rental would take on a whole new meaning.
right.
Oh, man. When you first heard this concept, we'll talk about how you got involved and what you did. What did you say in language we can tolerate?
Well, see, it can't be in language that we can say, but I can paraphrase. The original ask was, would I be willing to put together the operational framework and build a briefing that described it? Basically,
So-
on my own dime, just would I? And then the thing was, if this goes forward, then the full-time employment would be you being one of the aggressor pilots.
And that was kind of important because you'd just been furloughed from the airlines. You were
I just received notice.
with the Air Force Reserve.
Right. I just found out I was going to be furloughed, so I had about 4 or 5 months to find a job.
Because food's important. And that would play a role. That played a role in this Russian interest in this contract. You were dealing with Russian engineers and pilots and maintainers that, because of the end of the Cold War, were looking for work.
They were out of work, and they were all basically, it was like the Wild West. They were these entire, the premier flight, the equivalent of Edwards Air Force Base, Dryden Flight Center, was left to its own devices to go figure out how to make money. So
and they were still on the government payroll, but there's no pay in the role.
There's no pay in
they found work.
Roger. So they were left to go out and become entrepreneurial themselves, which is what this program was an example of.
Wow. It's hard to imagine that the shock to the system for somebody who's been on the, part of the Soviet structure. Everything's guaranteed, and they're kind of at the top of the Soviet structure in terms of status and probably relatively money. And now they're will fly for food. Kind of.
They absolutely were. They absolutely were, and that just heightened the shock as far as our perception of dealing with them. They, here we are. We used to be, a year ago, we were at the top of the pyramid, and now we're out, begging for work out from the West. So we had to be sensitive.
Real example of necessity is the mother of invention. So I was in an event today where we honored somebody who serves one of the charities I work with, the Armed Services YMCA in Hawaii. And I talked about the transition to Hawaii. And one of the things I've learned here is be nice because you never know how you're going to intersect. And this story of potentially making this deal is a matter of friendship. The friendships formed in your circles with the Navy when you were a Navy exchange pilot, or Air Force exchange pilot with the Navy, I should say. And folks, if you can hear the blinds rattling in the background, sorry, it's a little windy in Hawaii. And also credibility. And I want to hit that because frankly, I think society's lost sight of that. the beautiful thing about being a fighter pilot is you got to be able to fly. And you had credibility with the Navy. The Navy had credibility with you. These were very credible aviators on the Russian side. And without that, nobody would have been interested. Safe to
No,
say?
I agree. And as I said, the guy that reached out to me on this program was Skipper Ospearson, the same guy that
Mhm.
asked me to go. And so he and I were known to each other. So I think there was a level of comfort and on his part that they could trust me to not only come in and put something together, but get the right group of guys around us to man the thing once it went
Yeah.
down range and pull it off.
So you have this concept, and now it's up to you and a guy named Broadway Perosi, one of your colleagues from VX4, I think it was.
Yes.
And you're going to go to Russia, get checked out in the Su-27, and then you're going to fly to Singapore for an air show and demonstrate to everybody what a cool idea this is. What? Is that right?
That was the plan. Part of it came to fruition. We didn't
Yeah,
take
and
it.
we'll get to that in a second. The flying to Singapore from the outskirts of Moscow,
Right.
uh, first of all, intrigues me. Folks, go to Google Maps and look at the countries that are between here and there. Not to mention the mountains like the Himalayas. Um, it's what an idea! What an adventure this had to be. This had to be just even thinking about this had to have a Twilight Zone element to it.
Oh, I told you, I think I mentioned before, we're flying and we're on final, it's on a Delta airplane out of New York, on final into Moscow. And it was just all surreal. I made the comment that I felt like Captain Kirk on his first visit to the Klingon homeworld. It didn't seem real. It didn't seem right. But very quickly, in just a matter of days, things settled down and there were some, one-off things that we would have happen to us and so forth that would remind us that it's not the same. But it began to swing more towards normal, and we became relatively comfortable quickly.
Yeah, for those who didn't live it, it's hard to explain how seismic the shift was.
Yeah.
Because you were an F-15 pilot in your first assignment at Bitburg Air Base, Germany. The job of the 36th Fighter Wing, right?
Right.
Bitburg was to shoot down Soviet airplanes defending Europe when as we all knew they would, the Soviets invaded, the Warsaw Pact invaded. That was your focus. As a young F4 pilot, I was a nuke strike pilot. My job was to go drop a nuclear weapon on a classified target on the other side of the line. That was our life. And you, perhaps until Russia invaded Ukraine, it's been unimaginable for 25 or 30 years. So you made that shift from the imaginable to the unimaginable in a few months. Wow. Um, so that was the concept. You were going to do that. You're all set to do that. But what I think our viewers really want to hear about is what it was like to fly the Su-27 flanker. Before we talk about that, let me plug the perhaps more serious episode we're going to do at some point. Time to be announced, but please watch for it. Jay Fidel, the president and CEO and one of the founders of Think Tech Hawaii, is going to interview Dallas and I and talk about this thing we think is very important: collective nuclear blackmail. Just imagine. So please keep an eye open for that. I'll be back with Figments in 2 weeks. Another interesting episode. My government ordered me to bomb Hawaii. That's all I'm going to say about it. All right. Okay, Dallas, let's talk about flying the mighty flanker. And um, you had to go through a lot to get there in a demanding environment. One of the pictures you provided me is this snowscape. That looks cold, brother.
It was cold.
It looks
very cold.
it looks cold, and it's so iconic. All the Russian, previously Soviet aircraft kind of strewn about on the flight line.
One of the dichotomies that I mentioned to you before is you look at that snowscape. And then
Mhm.
when we went out to do our first walk around of the airplane out on the ramp, it was immaculate. The
Yeah,
wheel wells, everything was, it was pristine. Cockpit was pristine. It's and it's a big airplane. It's bigger than the Tomcat, but it is a sleek, it's a pretty
so let's talk a little more about that, because that's kind of shocking. In a second, before we do that, I would say all this involved a lot of preparation, briefing, academics, and this picture and socialization. You talked about the international vodka consumption competition, whatever you called it. So you did that. You met this guy, um, Sergey, and I'm going to try to pronounce his name again. Sergey, help me out. Vet
Tresvietsky.
Trezvietsky. In an article I saw that you wrote about this experience, you made a comment that intrigued me. You said you soon became best friends, but he didn't speak any, or very good friends.
Very
He,
little.
he didn't speak any English, and that resonated because I've been through that with a couple of guys in Vietnam, including one of their aces, one of their 6 kill aces, where we don't share a common language, but as warriors, aviators, doesn't matter. Tell me just a bit about the friendship with Sergey.
Well, again, as I told you, he was the business partner.
Yeah,
He was not our instructor pilot. Another guy named
right,
Anatoly
right.
Kovachev was the instructor pilot. But because of that, we met with Sergey almost every day. And as it turned out,
Mhm.
as we got into this, and it was apparent that all of these challenges that we were having with our training, no dash one or NATOPS manual, no
No
simulator,
books,
no
basically.
books. We're having
A
to
book-free
transcribe
training environment.
and everything. Sergey was really, and his translator, the lady Galina Sakharova that was in those
Yeah.
pictures, really leaned forward to try to make this work. Now, this was not, it's in their own self-interest to have this thing
Sure.
come to fruition. But and when we realized how much they were actually pushing as far as they could on their side to get some things done, then that gained trust on our part. That
Do you still stay in touch with Sergey? Out of
no, we
curiosity?
lost touch. We lost touch
Yeah,
a few years ago. Many years after this, they came and visited us. He and Galena came and visited
yeah.
us when we had a place down in Marble Falls, and we stayed close for a while, but we've lost touch.
So I had a moment with the senior Vietnamese official when I was director at APCSS, or I was speaking to him. He didn't speak English. His deputy, who was a great guy, gee, he's just a great guy. But I said to the principal through the translator, 40 years ago today, as it happened, was the heaviest bombing of Vietnam by the U.S. And here we are making peace, and cooperating. And the translator translated, and then his deputy, who speaks perfect English, Bui Chang, said, "I know, because 40 years ago I was sitting on a 57 millimeter anti-aircraft site shooting at American, or a 57 millimeter anti-aircraft site shooting at American airplanes." And I said, "Well, that's interesting, because I've been shot at by 57 millimeter anti-aircraft, not from the Vietnamese, but I bet we have a whole different view of that dealio." And the humanity matters more than the previous uh, antipathy, whatever. The old warriors, there's a value to old warriors meeting. So you go through all this, as you said, it was a book-free environment. Most of the training programs that I've been involved with involved manuals and diagrams of the airplane. Dallas, did you have that?
We did not. Now I've got one sitting. I've got one now. After we were done, they handed me the flight manual and said, "Here you go."
Yeah, now that you're done.
Now that we're done, but no, we didn't. So it was, but we made it work. And
Yeah.
literally, Broadway and I would sit and diagram whatever the session was, what hydraulics, electrical system, whatever. We diagram, we show it to the tech, and say, "Is this
So
close?"
wow. I hope you can draw because I can't. So on the left on the screen, folks, is them working that problem. But on the right is a guy with a camera because the flip side of the entrepreneurial spirit of necessity and the friendship from Sergey and Galina, et cetera, is the suspicion you were under. So you were filmed constantly,
That guy
right?
met us, that guy met us at customs.
For
And
2 months.
he was pretty much everywhere we went.
The TikTok generation might think that was cool. That would be cool for me for about, I don't know, 30, 40 seconds.
Yeah, it got old.
Wow. And you were under suspicion, not Sergey, but others thought that you might be CIA operatives sent there to basically spy from in the cockpit.
This came out when we're getting ready. I'm getting ready to make my first flight, the first flight. So I was going to
Mhm.
go. Kavacher and I had already briefed the hop. Everything were ready to go. I'm putting on my G suit and getting my harness and helmet and so forth. And one of the aeronautical engineers that worked for Sergey, a guy named Vasily Akrameyev, walked into life support there and had his head down and wouldn't look. And I knew something was going on. And then he said, "Hey, you guys have got to realize that all of these flights, you need to fly in the back seat
Instead of the front seat
instead of the
as
front seat,
agreed upon.
as agreed upon." And that's when I looked up at Vasily and he said, that's it. And I started taking off my G suit and hanging up my gear. And I looked over at Sergey and I said, that cancels the contract. That cancels everything. We're going back to they had us billeted in a
Wow.
KGB general's resort spa. I
Yeah.
said, we're going back to the spa and work on getting our way home. That
Wow.
Sergey went and talked to the head of the research institute at Gromov and basically worked a deal that if we agreed to fly the first flight in the back seat, Kavacher would then go to this guy. The director was a guy named Konstantin Vasilchenko. And Kavacher would go and give him a thumbs up as to whether we really were pilots.
So you proved you weren't spies. I wish we had more time. We'll do more time on this later, probably someday. But Kavacher is Anatoly Kavacher, your instructor pilot. As it turns out, he and Sergey are the principals in two of the most watched ejection sequences
Yes.
in the world. Sergey from a MiG-29 that has a right engine stall stag at the Paris Air Show, and Anatoly from his airplane being cut in half by another MiG-29 at a British Air Show.
Right.
Did that cause you any concern? That
No,
these
but
two
what
guys had both been in high-profile ejections?
I mean, it got our attention, but with Broadway and I both said we paid a lot of attention to our ejection seat training
Roger.
when we finally got it.
Okay, so there's so much to talk about here, but eventually you fly two backseat, one front seat ride.
One
It
back
doesn't-
seat,
one ba-
three front seat.
Three front seat. Okay, sorry. Three front seat. That's right. Yeah. And so tell me about flying the Su-27 flanker from how the cockpit just talk to another fighter. I'm with you in the O Club bar, and I say, Dallas, you flew the flanker. Tell me about it. You know, I wouldn't just say, tell me about it. There'd be another word there.
Beautiful airplane. Good things, bad things. Big bubble canopy. Visibility was bad in all quadrants. The head box of the ejection seat was about this big. They wanted you to sit the ejection seat so low it was a CG type thing, so it could meet its 0-0 requirements. But when you put it there, the stick grip was so far above your lap, you couldn't rest your elbow on your knee to fly. So I did that once, and then I raised the seat all the way up and said, I'm not going to eject anyway.
Yeah.
I'm going to do this. So there were bad things. Roll rate, as you mentioned something, the roll rate was like a Tomcat with the wings all the way forward. It was not good. The thing was absolutely phenomenal, the most impressive over any aircraft I've ever flown. The term is piece of best, but let's just call it power.
Yeah, brute power.
Brute power and control in the pitch axis. It was a bull moose. It just, you could power through. Like I told, one day went out and I just got to 450 knots, set the power, went to blower. I did 3 loops in
Pull after
succession.
one. Yeah. Wow,
Each,
holy moly. Okay, so
each,
that means something to me.
but each one was completed in less than 2,500 feet vertical. And at the end of the third one, all I did was momentarily unload, and I was back up to 425 knots.
So let me ask you this, because we both flew different versions of the Viper, the F-16, and early and late engines in the F-15 Eagle. Could you be pretty free with your throttle movement?
Yes.
Put it wherever the heck you wanted without worrying
Yes.
about the sounds and parts that were going to come out of the back of the engine?
No, it was like an Eagle with a digital electronic control.
Deke, yeah.
The Deke. Very much unlike the Tomcat and the TF-30, where
Right.
once I put the throttles anywhere,
Mhm.
I didn't move.
Interesting. Is it your favorite airplane ever?
No.
I knew that, but I had to ask.
This, and again, when I got back and we started going around and briefing, going to different squadrons, and we went to the UK, we went to Sweden, we went to Saudi Arabia, we went to Belgium and Netherlands and so forth. And whenever we would be talking to a group of fighter pilots, that was the question that they would ask.
Of course, yeah.
And I would go and say, hey, it's a beautiful airplane. I enjoyed flying it. There are things that are not optimum. I loved flying the F-16. Loved all that. Loved flying, taking the Hornet to the ship. But my first fighter was the Eagle, and it's always got a soft spot in my heart.
Okay, Ernest Hemingway.
Yeah.
But I'll say the Eagle wasn't my first fighter, and I flew both the F4, F-15, F-16, the F-16 in combat. It's a great airplane, but the Eagle is unique, and that's part of why it has a 104-0 kill ratio, and it's just a beautiful airplane. Easy to land. Looks like it would be easy to land.
Absolutely. The first on that flight when I was flying from the back seat, all Anatoly did was start the engines and lower the canopy, and he gave me the airplane. So other than that, and then he demoed the first Cobra and he demoed the first tail slide. He didn't touch the stick the entire time. So first landing, I'm coming in and it's a straight in. It's like a four-man's ILS, and it was easier. It was easier than the Eagle from the back seat, about like a T-30.
Well, Eagle's pretty damn easy, so
yeah,
that's saying something.
But
okay.
That back seat sits quite a bit higher.
Yeah, I can picture that. I wish we had more time, and that's a good way to be in an episode where you're not going, how do I stretch this out? But so you spent 2 months over there with the Russian aerospace industry and the military connection, and probably the KGB as well.
Oh, definitely.
In a very turbulent point of transition. Is there anything you observed that you think about now as you look at the invasion of Ukraine and the tragic outcome of that?
I spoke to it when I wrote that article years ago about there's an institutional aversion within Russian training and within the way they construct their airplanes to allowing a pilot to take an airplane to the absolute limits and trusting the pilot. There was things in the flight control system where it would take control of the airplane from the pilot. The way that, and this is not meant to be derogatory, but they're very linear. They're very, you could say, plotting. When I watched that caravan north of Kyiv sit there for a week or 10 days and not move, and there's no initiative to go and do anything, and they're
well, I had some ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I had some ideas on how to do it too, but that is their mindset. There's nobody in that caravan that's going to go, I've got it. We're going to figure this out. We're going to go this way.
So let me take that the next step, and then we'll sadly have to wrap up. To me, that explains why they've devolved to an extremely brute force approach to just throwing iron on target, including shopping malls today. It's just, they're just gonna keep pounding until they achieve their objectives, which is, there's much more commentary in that. But a sad state of affairs, somewhat predictable, I would say. Well, Dallas, thanks, man. I will see you with Jay on an episode of Military in Hawaii sometime soon. We'll find out if it's Wednesday or not. I always finish with asking what the guest's next figment is. We asked Dallas that last week, and we've got a shared figment, and it is to open people's eyes to this concept of nuclear blackmail and how the United States has to rethink its strategy and operations and equipment for deterring and defending against nuclear blackmail from anybody who might seek to do it. But on a lighter note, I then end with, what would Fig do? I've got another movie for you folks. It's Jet Pilot, starring John Wayne and Janet Leigh from 1957. It was actually filmed, I think, from 1949 to 1954. It was a Howard Hughes movie, his favorite movie. It's a Cold War drama and romance. I'm going to see if I can get my screen to the movie poster of it. Let me read you the poster. Jet flame action, jet hot thrills, exploding with all the power of the jet age, with all the passion of a daring love story. It's actually a very entertaining movie and will give you some interesting insight into the events of the day. So don't forget, you can find our QR codes, or you can find our episode lists on the web here, as you see. Please do that. I use that not just to find other episodes, but to make sure I'm not wearing the same shirt 2 shows in a row. And I want to finish by thanking ThinkTech Hawaii, a great nonprofit corporation over 20 years of enabling citizen journalists like me in Dallas. So thanks for watching, and aloha.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.